Thank you, Marie. Another excellent presentation this afternoon here at the conference. Been sitting for a while, folks. Hands in the air, quick hands in the air, hands in the air, hands in the air, hands in the air, hands in the air. Hands down side to side. Still shaking, still shaking. Hands down the side. Hands in the air again, hands in the air again. Okay, we're going to break shortly for afternoon tea, but not right now. First of all, after successful careers in IT and venture capital, Chris Golis is now in his third role as a coach and trainer in emotional intelligence. His speciality is the 7MTF hum, which is a scientifically valid technology that profiles a person's temperament. It's particularly useful in helping you identify and handle corporate psychopaths and bullies, apparently. Worth knowing. Would you please welcome Chris Golis?
Thanks very much to
Thank you, Chris.
And to Adrian for organising today. All conferences always take a long time. Right. Yes, well, the books, I just handing that out. I'd like to see that you saw a wonderful planned strategy of public relations in action today. That's right. What actually happened is, as you'll find, I've actually written 3 books, hard copy ones, and I happen to have the odd box in my cellar of this one. So I did it as a chat. I took this conference as an opportunity to get rid of a box. So I was quite amazed. Right. Is this the clicker? Can I do that? Yes. Okay. Today's talk, I'm going to try and define emotional intelligence. I think I'll give you the best definition. Then discuss what I think is the best sales technique ever invented. Give you an introduction about how to use it. I'm actually going to give you a couple of case studies. I thought the previous presentation by Marie was excellent, and there are 2 wonderful messages. There are a number of very, very, very good messages in it. 1 or 2 things I'll actually correct, but I have to welcome that opportunity. But the 2 huge messages I want to get across to you is, first of all, one is in selling, you sell to the heart, not to the head. Selling is an emotional process. If you don't get that emotional link with your prospect, he or she will not convert into a client. The other thing, which was a wonderful case study going with 6 salespeople in the car, we like those who are like ourselves. Now, those poor salesmen, fortunately, weren't transgender individuals, so they couldn't change themselves into females. But the big message she was given is that she was not getting what she described as a feminine way of selling to her, right? Which was asking that the big message, and they had a big failure. They hadn't worked out who the decision maker was. If you're basically 2 people there, the first thing you've got to do is work out who's the decision maker and who's the recommender. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Chris. I do apologize because we've got live mics and yes, etc. All right. So those 2 big messages I want to get across are part of, I think, any presentation on emotional intelligence and selling. Right. My background, very simply, I did my first degree at Cambridge, joined what was the Facebook and Google at the time, IBM. This is in '67, and I worked as a training assistant programmer with them for 2 years, then did 2 startups, both which collapsed in 9 months, and then ended up being a project manager in Amsterdam. I then did an MBA at the London Business School, and my tutor was this gentleman here. You may not have heard of him. He was described by Fortune magazine in the 1990s as the best management guru in the world. And the fact that it was English made it even more extraordinary because Fortune is very, very pro-American. And I was very fortunate. Charles Handy, not only was the dean of the MBA program at London Business School, he was my tutor. And in '73, there was a big recession on, and Charles said to me, "Chris, have you managed to get a job yet?" And I said, "Charles, I've got the big one. I've been flown twice to New York by McKinsey's, and they've offered me a position at their head office in New York." And he said, "You know, Chris, I don't know if I'd accept that if I were you." I said, "What?" I mean, this is a dream job practically of every MBA student. He said, "I've been thinking about what makes business success." And he said, "I've come to the conclusion it's being able to handle yourself in a one-on-one meeting. That's what makes business success. That's when you close the sale, you get the finance, you hire good hires, you basically have to fire people occasionally." He said, "Being able to handle yourself in a one-on-one meeting, I think, is the key to business success." Now, the good thing about MBA programs is they don't teach you that. Right, and he said, "I've tried to work out the best way of doing it, and I'll tell you one thing, it's not being a consultant with McKinsey." He said, "You'll be okay at that," but he said, "There's a lot of them." And he said, "You only hear about the ultra success stories, not the ones that get tossed on the scrap heap, which is basically there. He said, if I were you, if I forget joining McKinsey's, I'd look at becoming a salesperson. And in fact, that's what I ended up doing. One of my colleagues at the business school, his dad was a director of ICL. You may remember the name of the English computer company. I wanted to come to Australia, and he got me a job here, and I maneuvered my way into selling. And that's how I sort of started a career sales. And that's when I learned this technology, which I'm going to describe to you shortly. Right. Now, in terms of emotional intelligence, this is a definition. This isn't mine. This is a chap called Daniel Goleman. And Daniel Goleman wrote the book Emotional Intelligence. It came out in 1995, sold 5 million copies in the first 5 years. Now, what had happened was he had met two gentlemen called Salovey and Miller, who were actually developing the concept of emotional intelligence. And he actually took their ideas, and because he was a very good writer, he's an excellent writer, he was the science writer for the New York Times, he then wrote the book. And they're gnashing their teeth ever afterwards, because this guy basically built up a very successful career consulting in emotional intelligence. I mean, they're well known as the gurus, and one ended up as a professor at Yale, so we can't, which is like the CEO of Yale University, so we can't feel too sorry for him, but it's very fitting. Now, Goleman's model was basically, you think of yourself, and you think of others, and there's understanding, and then influencing, right? That's the basic, that's a 2x2 matrix, as you can see, obviously Goleman did an MBA, right? And self-understanding, the easiest way, if you want to do it, you can go to my website. In the business card, I inserted a card, so the website's on the back, which is emotionalintelligencecourse.com. And there's a simple little test you can do. The menus across the top. It's called a quiz. I call it a personal emotional intelligence assessment score. And that'll give you a very simple 21 forced questions, and that'll give you an understanding what your core dominant emotions are. Self-influencing is basically controlling your emotions. That's the secret to emotional intelligence of the self. It isn't going with the flow. I'm not big on mindfulness. I mean, I think meditation, look, some people love it, and if you love it, I'd say go ahead and do it. I just say life's too short. And I'm sorry, I'm drinking. I basically just underwent my third bout of cancer. Just before Christmas, I had the wonderful present being told I have a throat cancer, or cancer on my right tonsil, and it spread to my lymph nodes. So I've just undergone 7 weeks of radiation and chemotherapy, which blasts the heck out of my saliva glands. So I have to drink water. And I lost my prostate in 2014. That means I'm at the loo half the time, but I'm sorry about that. And then just to cap it off, I had melanoma in the year 2000 and given a 10% chance to survive in the first 6 months. My two daughters at the moment call me the cat with 6 lives. I've used up 3 already. Okay, others is basically empathy, understanding others. And there's some people who have it naturally. They have compassionate empathy, right? And then influencing others is what I call social skills, which is a very nice way of saying, have you got selling skills? So that's really that's my model of emotional intelligence and what I use. Right. Now, what have I done wrong? It's not going forward. Maybe it's better. Oh, yeah. Now, if you read Goleman's book, which is highly recommended, he gives some wonderful examples. Okay. In the appendix, he asks the question, is there a model of core emotions? And he refers to a guy called Ekman, who you may have heard of him. I think the thing about how they lie to me, and he's the guy who does facial expressions and micro expressions is what he calls them. There's only one slight problem with it. It's utter rubbish as a concept. The U.S. government spent $1 billion trying to train people at security sites basically to read facial expressions, and at the end, after they'd spent $1 billion, said it was a complete waste of time. So I just only put this in. Ekman's still preaching the model, but I just think to myself, this is ridiculous. I've done his course. I was hopeless at it. So I thought, well, etc. But the section of the book is at the final paragraph of Appendix A, Goleman talks about levels of emotional intensity. And he says, we all have emotions all the time. In fact, I've just spoke at the Emotional Intelligence Congress in Perth. They have it every 2 years. And I gave a paper there. I gave one 2 years ago at Oporto. And the main thing is everyone's focused on the top 2 levels, on emotions all the time. Or I think the important thing is temperament, right? And what happens to temperament? These are genetically, basically imprinted emotional dispositions, right? And that, to me, is the key part of your person. That's the emotional part of your personality. And if you've got a model of that, you've got a great start in life. And what then Goldman says, and then what can happen is you can have basically these core emotional predispositions can be so strong they turn into a mental disorder. And 1%, well, everyone sort of has different percentages, small ones, but there you have mental disorders. Well, that model, I think, is the best model out. I think Goldman was right on the track. And the model I'm going to talk about to you today is, in fact, what I call the 7-MTF hum. Right. What the model says is that it started off in the 1920s. A guy called Rosenoff was trying to work out what does make us tick emotionally. And what he said is that, well, first of all, we're not sane or insane. In fact, we're all slightly mad, right? And he said what we're on is a spectrum of sanity and insanity. It isn't you're on an extrovert or an introvert, you're on a scale of introversions. Of course, this is before, we had things like autism spectrum disorder, people being on the spectrum, right? And then what he said is in fact there were 4 key mental illnesses, and then there's a 5th factor called the normal. That was his model, which acts as a controlling factor on the other 4, right? Hum and Wadsworth lived during the 1930s. They developed the first decent personality test, and they said Rosenoff was on the right track, but there weren't effectively 5 normals. There were 7 factors, right? And 7 is the magic number. I don't know if you know why. I explained it in the book. It's the limit of short-term memory. You can remember 7 items. So what you should do is always when you're trying to sort of convey a concept, etc., don't have more than 7 items in the list, right? That's the secret. Occasionally, telephone companies like Telstra here switch your telephone numbers to 8 digits, right? So you dial wrong numbers, and then they get more revenue. And I put that to several general managers at Telstra, and they look at me coldly and walk away, right? Okay, I mean, you think about America, the telephone digits basically are all 7 digits long, right? They have an area code, which is another 3 digits, right? And I'm just trying to put out to you, this is just an interesting concept. And that was proven, a guy called Miller wrote this famous paper. It's the most widely quoted psychology paper, right? So the 7 mental illnesses you can see up here on the left, and one of my sort of contributions to this model is I converted them to, in fact, stereotypes, right? And I tried to use the same initial, because in this tool, you tend to say people are big M, high H's, low P's. So versus people suffering from paranoia or high on the pesticide, I call them politicians. So when Tuddenhope was looking at things saying, look at politicians, he was thinking I was speaking about someone like him. Well, in fact, I was speaking like something because he does have a lot of politician in him, right? Because he didn't give a damn about the time limits. He just spoke right through it, right? He didn't give a stuff about you, right? So, I mean, he thought, mate, you were right on the spectrum there. So I didn't really mean, but I mean, I'm just trying to give you the flavor. Right. Okay. The other thing I did is, and you'll see it in the book, is I call it top dog. This is for people who have no empathy, which according to me, my wife describes me perfectly. Okay, and she said, and I say, instead of having some natural compassion to people, sympathy, all right, it's for those people who don't have that, they can use this tool, which says the way people talk, the organization they work for and their position in that organization, okay, it's very, very key clues to their temperament, their dominant components, the way they dress, effectively what their office or their home or the car they drive are all sort of big clues. And the gambit is whether they keep you waiting for a meeting and then how soon they start using your first name verbally to do it. That's like the opening moves of chess. So that's the 2 clues. So just to give you a feel, this is like the engineer. This is people who are high on the OCD spectrum, right? They're painstaking planners, compulsive readers, practical and objective. They tend to love completing projects, and they hit them with dedicated enthusiasm. Hands-on operators, process is everything to an engineer, right? And they're not that good at delegation. That's one of their weaknesses. They tend to sort of be micromanagers. So in terms of top dog, right? Oops, back one. So, and you got very lucky. In the Big Bang Theory, you've got 4 engineers in action. Right? Okay, now they're slightly different, as you'll see later on. Howard's basically got a lot of hustler in him. Goose Powley is an artist. He beats to a different drum. walks up on the other side of the fence. Leonard's a double checker engineer, right, which we'll talk to them. And Sheldon is a politician engineer, I'm always right. Right. The talk tends to be monotonic, almost slightly boring because they get very excited subject in. Organization, they work as builders and developers. Typically, they work as consultants. Dress is, green is their favorite color. But one of the interesting things about their dress is they have pens in their pocket. Their dress doesn't quite mix and match, right? So, and you can see that there on the right. Offices, whiteboards full of basically bookshelves. And the gamut is they tend to be functional and friendly. And I had a wonderful presentation by an engineer, and that was John Groy. And so if you hold out the slide, I mean, the thing is, you first of all see a lot of green. You see he's trying to change it into a numerical process, right? The counting, etc. He's got it very nicely detailed out. This is a document produced by an engineer, right? So whenever you want to get John on side, what do? Well, you do this. Prearrange the meetings. Time's important to people like John, right? You wallow in the detail, because they love it, right? Give them brochures and manuals, because they love reading. They love to test drive your product or service, so you give them the opportunity to do it. And then you plan. The magic words of them are plan, task, project timetable, clear factual presentations, and you use feeling words like hot, cold, and touch. Okay, so that basically gets them going.
Can I add something in there?
Yeah.
Really, really smart and as thick as 2 bricks.
No, some of them are very smart. I mean,
No, a lot of them are smart. They're as thick as 2 bricks. They've got no common sense.
they would actually say I'm quite practical. If you said they lack what I call touch with reality, I would say to you, and not knowing what the real world is, yes, they can be dreamers. Some can, on the first to admit it. That's normally in combination with another couple of components, or a low and being. You either got some low hustler, they're the realist in life, or you got a little bit of the artist, because the artists have big imaginations. All right? I'm just trying to give you a flavor. I mean, it's etc. I mean, I don't like, you got to be careful when you etc. Right. So I'm just going to quickly describe to you the first sale where I used this technique. And it was Electricity Commission of, there we are, that's what I need. Just keep that there. New South Wales. What had happened, I was doing this job, I was a trainee salesman at ICL, and there were four people sitting in desks in a row, and I was at the end, I was the trainee, and they said, what you do is they gave me a telephone book and said, start cold calling. And of course, if anyone's ever done that, that's the most terrible job in the world. You ring people up and they say, bang, right? Why should I speak to you? And suddenly on my desk, there was this tender document. And it was an Electricity Commission of New South. It was an IBM account. And I just said, this is fantastic. Someone wants to buy a computer and they're telling me they want to buy it. Oh, so I get on it says, ring this number if you want to have an appointment. So I ring the number and I say, isn't this fantastic, to the 4 guys there? And of course, they're sitting there saying, yes, Chris, you go for it. They are pissing themselves. Because the system was, a tender doc would go in, sit on this desk and go to the first salesman, who's the most senior one. And if he didn't want to do it, he'd turn to that one. And then he'd go to the next guy and turn to that one. And then he'd go to the next guy. So I was getting a tender that had been rejected by all the other 4 salesmen in the place. Right, and I was so naive. We were actually getting a couple of tenders a week, I discovered later. Anyway, so I go and see this guy, and I see him, and he's got closed and fit. He speaks in a monotone. He's a project manager with Electricity Commission. I mean, doing projects on electricity things. And what happens is the CEO of the Electricity Commission, he's been very successful, called this guy in and said, Neville, our IT department's absolutely a crappy mess. We've got the worst IT department in Sydney. Fix it. Right, so Neville was given the job of fixing up their computer systems. And what he did is he produced this tender. And of course, IBM were there writing it around themselves. I mean, this is typically how tenders work. And I started talking to him, and he had the pictures of projects on the wall, full desk, and he was chatting away. And I walked out of the meeting and said, this guy is a high E. We called him epileptoids at the time, but he was a high engineer. And I looked up that technology about, techniques you use, and I said, well, they like reading the manuals. So I said, I rang in a couple of days later. I said, can I come around and see you again? He said, sure. So I went and I said, look, everyone talks about hardware when they're buying computers, technology. I said the key thing, I worked for 4 years on IBM computers, it's not the hardware, it's the software. Software is the key. I'm going to recommend that you use our most sophisticated operating system called George 3. They have amazing things, like there's a thing called a visual display unit, where instead of entering stuff through punch cards, you enter it on a TV screen with a keyboard attached to it. He goes, oh, sounds fascinating. And I said, they got some very other big innovations. They can run more than one program at the same time. It's called multi-programming. He goes, oh. And of course, this is basically, this is 71, 72. PCs, hadn't come out. Anyway, he said, yeah. And I said, by the way, I've got this manual on the George 3 operating system, an introduction to George 3. Would you like to look at it? And he said, yes. And he reached across and he grabbed the manual. Like I'd given him the holy book. Anyway, he started off, okay, and I sort of rang him a couple of days later and said, have you had a chance to look at it? He said, I was up to 4 in the morning reading it last night. Fascinating. Do you want another one? You've got another manual? And I said, yes, it's the full one. Oh, yeah, do you mind if I keep this one and give it to 2 of my staff I'm having on the team? I said, no. In the end, over the next 3 weeks, I gave him 7 manuals. Right. Then he said, Chris, well, we've got to run this benchmark. And I said, yeah. Well, I said, that's okay. I said, look, Woolworths is a George 3 client, first in Sydney. What you can do is I'll set up an appointment. You go up there at 5 o'clock with your guys, and you run the benchmark. And I'll send along a system engineer. I thought, well, I don't want to go there in the evening. I've got better things to do. And I said, you run it with him. You run the benchmark with him, and see how it goes. And he said, sure. So I thought, oh, well, even for a penny in for a pound. Anyway, next morning I ring up his office to see how it went. And they said, he hasn't come in yet. I went, funny. So I ring the Woolworths, DP department. I said, these guys come in last night at 5 o'clock. And they said, oh, they're still here. This is like 9:30 in the morning. I said, really? They said, oh, yeah. Can I speak to Neville Warner, please? So he brings it. I said, Neville, you're still there. He said, Chris, we've got the benchmark down to 14 minutes and 22 seconds. But we reckon we can get another 2 minutes off it. Do you mind us sitting here and running some more? I said, Neville, whatever rows your boat, you go right ahead. Now, is he going to buy? Is he going to buy? This guy's going to buy, right? I mean, he's not putting that sort of effort in and not buying, right? So he did. It was the only account that ICL took off IBM in the world that year. In the world. All the other basically switches from ICL, IBM went the other way. IBM was knocking off ICL account after ICL account. Of course, I was like the hero, not just in Australia, but basically at an international sales conference. Because I, was introduced and standing. I actually resigned basically when the conference finished because I'd been offered headhunted for another job. But you've got to take glory when it comes. Anyway, and people come and say, how much discount do you give him? I said, I don't give any discount at all. Oh, surely you do. Where'd you take him to lunch? I said, I didn't take him to any lunches. Okay, because these guys, the salesmen were all hustlers, right? And I said, no. I said, well, they said, well, how'd you get it? I said, well, I gave him 7 manuals to read, and I got him to spend all night running a benchmark. And they went, okay. Anyway, as you could say, now, of course, I was now sold on this method. I thought, this is fantastic. So that's what happened. Right. The next one is artists. They're driven by the desire to create. They suffer from autism, and they're inarticulate, reserved, very self-conscious, oversensitive, tend to be stubborn and single-minded, good visual imaginations, and an individual beat to a different drum. And they basically, Richard Branson's a good example. They tend to be inarticulate. 5 minutes to go, I'll get through there. Okay. And there's a lovely article about him. He's got a public persona. Everyone thinks he's sort of fluent. He's not. He's very inarticulate. I've never met him, but I know someone who has and said it's amazing. He says ah, and more than anyone else she'd ever met, and that's what the reporter said. And classically, what have I hit? Me? I'd like to know, yeah. Okay, presentation techniques, but then they need lots of visuals. One-on-one is a long, slow sale. Use your imagination. Sincerity and sensitivity is very important, and don't be pushy. And an example I've got here is from Nellie Cruz, article about here. She arrives alone without an entourage. Her English is surprisingly hesitant. Photography is private, pleasant, and she's very reserved. Now, what happened with her is that I have been asked by Alan Unwin, okay, they had contacted a woman. I was now working in venture capital, and they wanted to write about venture capital, and they contacted Edna Peru and said, he wants you to write this book. And I said, sure. So anyway, she said, you'll be getting a phone call from a guy called John Ironmonger. And I said, okay. And so I got the phone call, and he said, why don't we meet for lunch? I've got this little bistro in North Sydney I like going to. So I said, sure. Took time out. Got there 5 minutes early. Was directed to the table. They said, Mr. Ironmonger will be shortly. He's one of our better customers. And was this guy, beard, cravat, silk shirt, Armani, avoiding eye contact. And I went, oh, Christ. The guy's a raging artist. They're the one people who really dislike me because I'm loud, arrogant, brash. So we're chatting away, and I'm avoiding eye contact, and I'm speaking quietly and very softly as I can, which is not easy. And he suddenly says, why don't you choose the wine? And I went, right. Because these people are individualistic. They beat to a different drum. So I pointed to the most expensive red on the menu. It was $400 a bottle. Pulled on my American Express card and said, look, you buy lunch, I'll buy the wine. And there's a long wait. He said, are you sure about the wine? I said, everything else on this menu is totally undrinkable. Okay, I said, no, it's the only wine we can have. And he looked at me, he said, the publisher always buys the first lunch with an author. Okay, put your card away. I said, if that's what you want, that's what you want. Now, is he going to do the book? Is he going to publish the book? Is he going to go back to his boss and say, here's an $800 expense claim, and not do the book? No, of course he's going to do the book. Also, he loved it. He loved it because basically most authors, first of all, say I don't drink, about a third of them, which of course really turns them off. Secondly, they order the house carafe, which is nearly as bad. But the worst ones order the second most cheapest wine on the menu, which we all know that's the one that the restaurateurs make the biggest gross margin on. So you don't know that. Anyway, that book, I'll tell you right now, books do give you credibility. Jane is quite right. That book's made me about $5 million, right? Because St. George Bank ended up basically wanted to set up a venture capital fund, and they sort of made it. Just whipping through the other 6 components, that's what books are worth, is movers. That's Tony Abbott, right? Absolutely classic, highly energetic, extrovert, tend to be cheerful and enthusiastic, and that's basically Tony. Double checkers, this is Woody Allen. Cautious expression, double checkers, Jane is a bit of a worked in the public service for 20 years. Jane was a double checker, but she's basically emerged as a butterfly out of the chrysalis, right? But they tend to be apprehensive, very sympathetic. I always think it's a great picture when they like brown earth colors. Okay, she's surrounded by 3 of the most beautiful women in the world looking miserable. By the way, these people you do not offer choices to. You assume the sale. You give them one choice because you got to reduce the risk. You don't do the alternate, do you want it in red or blue, close with them? Because they sit there and go, my God, if I choose red, this will happen. If I choose blue, that will happen. No, I can't make a decision now. It's impossible. Right, you say, this is the color you want, bang. Right, politicians, competitive and assertive, and as I said, Tuddenhope was a wonderful example of that in action, Julia Gillard. Hustlers, well, we're just so lucky that we have a corporate psychopath as the President of the United States, right? Red ties to give away, and may I, on such a Marie's speech just before mine, one of the very few speakers who mentioned money, consistently through her presentation. Red is her favorite color. She had a red top on. Classic hustler in action, right? And, there she was. I am an introvert. Yeah. Sure you are. Keep believing it, right? No. Yeah, she is a raging H, right? But she's very good. And H's make terrific salespeople because they are not scared for asking for the order. Right? And they also make very, very good entrepreneurs because they realize it's not whether you win or lose, it's how much money you're making, right? And they're absolutely right on the money, right? Hustlers are driven by self-interest. What's in it for me? That's the one radio station they listen to, right? And finally, normals, Again, I would object. Normals are basically, Howard was the normals normal. These people are very low on neuroticism, a lot of self-control. They want a business card. They're very conservative. They don't get a business card, they think what's wrong, right? They want to see brochures, they want to see manuals. And Howard was the norm was normal. And then the ultimate people you think of high ends are Japanese. Very manly. Japanese don't get a business card, they really are. Right. There we are. Takeaway 1. Here are 3 videos. They're on the website under resources. Don't take them down. By the way, this presentation is up on basically LinkedIn. No one mentioned it, but there's a thing called SlideShare, part of LinkedIn. You jump up PowerPoint situations. I always just load if I give a presentation like this, I just put it on LinkedIn, right? So you can see it, etc. But these are 3 guys on video, okay, basically telling you how they use the technology. They attended courses or worked with them, and they just basically give you an example. They all love the hump, thought it was brilliant, okay? There's a quick quiz on an emotionalintelligencecourse.com you can do. That'll teach you about yourself. Read the book I've given to you, right? Best of the work stuff yourself. And if you want to contact me, that's the email to get me on, right? I got a couple of others, and then I'll finish, all right? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Great work. It was informative and entertaining as always. Now, time for that break. Please enjoy your afternoon tea, your afternoon break. We'll take about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back with our final 2 presentations for the conference. Thank you, everyone.